Iraqi Confederation.
Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, You either run and do it, or you're running from it. Tell me, brother, where you're running? You're either running scared, or you're running free. Tell me, sister, how you running? If you're the big tree, and all the small legs, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away. Call me timber. Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Only way to kill a beast to attack the root. Pull it up from the ground and destroy the fruit. You're either telling lies or you're telling truth. Tell me, brother, sister, what do you do? If you're the big tree, and I'm the small legs, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away, chip away. Call me timber. Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with his head, off with his head, off with his head, off with his head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Almost out of time. Gotta free your mind. Almost out of time. Gotta feed the minds. Everything we do today. Sow the seeds for the next day. Sow the seed for the next day. The next day, the next day. Almost out of time. Gotta free your minds. Almost out of time. Gotta feed the minds. Everything we do today. Sow the seeds for the next day. Sow the seeds for the next day. The next day, the next day. Off with this head. Off with this head. Off with this head. Off with this head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete, Off with this head, off with this head, off with this head, off with this head. I cut you down with my machete. I cut you down with my machete,
Okay, greetings. Is this working? Is it working? I'm a production team of one, so I'm gonna need y'all's help. Can you hear me? Can you see me? If you can, put in the chat. My name is Onya Sanu. I am an editor with Hood Communist. We're an editorial team of 4, a very small operation. There's, of course, Comrade Erica from Black Alliance for Peace and Black Power Media. There's Comrade Musa, also from Black Alliance for Peace, and the Groundings podcast, and the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente. Hey, thank you so much for confirming Algerian Goku. I bet I knew who that is. Thank you, Rouse Pasta Sauce. And then also Comrade Salifu, comrade that works at the Thomas Sankara Center with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Greetings to all the folks in the chat. Thank you for helping me out. Teamwork makes the dream work. So this is, we are trying to build up the Hood Communist YouTube channel. We've maintained the blog for a little bit over 5 years now, putting out periodic revolutionary African nationalist analysis. We want to expand to more platforms. So we started off with Hood Communist Radio. We had the live Telegram chats with y'all in our Telegram channel, which if you're not in it, like get in it, get with the program t.me/hoodcommunist if you want to join. Can I put that in the chat? Can I do it? Yes, I'll do it right now. Join the Telegram. But yeah, we used to have weekly lives in there and talk to y'all, and then we would record those lives and put them up on Spotify. Then we started doing like very high production value interviews on our Spotify channel with different folks in the movement, different folks representing different struggles, talking about what's happening in the world, talking about imperialism. And then we were like, man, we're all cute, we're all charismatic. We should be on YouTube. Why can't you see our faces? And so we decided to start Hood Communist TV. One of the very first programs we did was like a 5th anniversary live last year. We also did a report back from a delegation to Cuba that we participated in last February. We were invited to participate in this really great conference. We went, we repped, we presented papers, and then we did a report back about that. And now we want to start getting into more frequent content, political education content, doing deeper explanatory deep dives about different aspects of the anti-imperial struggle, of the anti-colonial struggle, of the African liberation movement. So that is what this is about. So what we want to talk about today is settler-colonialism and sanctions in Zimbabwe. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that this presentation was initially prepared for a joint event that we did with the Florida Palestine Network here in occupied Seminole, Massagogo, Miccosukee territory, also known as Orlando, Florida. Florida Palestine Network is an incredible organization organizing for Palestinian national liberation and against Zionism. That's basically like uniting the anti-imperialist movement in Central Florida, y'all. They are consistently in the streets for Palestine, and when you go to their actions, it's like families, man. It's like Arabic and Palestinian families, elders, children. That's like always a good sign when you're engaged in movement work and for a particular national liberation struggle. And the people that are consistently showing up are, of course, people in solidarity, but also that community itself. Like that is what you love to see, especially multi-generational. And Florida Palestine Network brings that. And we've been working together for over a year and discussing more and more and more the intersections between our struggles. That the way that Palestine is discussed in the mainstream media, in the capitalist media, as in sort of like this exceptional, unknowable situation, like it's an ancient conflict and no one knows why it's happening, and the Israelis have a right to be there, they don't, and the Palestinians just won't accept it, they're not civilized, and all this kind of shit. But the reality is that what's happening in Palestine is the modern day version of settler colonialism. It's a genocide being carried out by a settler entity backed by Western imperialism. And it's not just happening in Palestine. In fact, it's happened all over the world for hundreds of years in place after place after place. And it is, in fact, how the so-called like first world, the Western world, the global imperialist powers like the United States, like the European nations, like Israel, the Zionist entity, like this is how they developed their wealth. This is how they developed their land bases. This is how they came to be superpowers that we are all forced to deal with. It is imperialism expanded through settler colonialism, and it happens all over the planet. And the only difference between what's happening in Palestine and what happened in Turtle Island, what happened in Algeria, what happened in Azania, what happened in Zimbabwe, like we're going to discuss today, is just that it was filmed and they're using modern weapons and has borrowed in the Facebook comments. But otherwise, like the tactics of targeting civilian populations, the tactics of engaging in land theft and genocide, the tactics of expanding imperialism through this process of settler colonialism. This is an old tactic carried out by the same people all over the world. And so Florida Palestine Network and the APRP in Orlando collaborated to produce this talk, Settler Colonialism and Sanctions in Zimbabwe, to do a deep dive into the history of how settler colonialism developed in Zimbabwe, how the Africans in Zimbabwe were able to overthrow it, and the connections we can find between that British settler colonial project in Zimbabwe and settler projects all over the world, including here in Turtle Island in the so-called United States. I used to say United Snakes. I don't say that anymore, even though it rolls off the tongue, because snakes are homies, y'all. Snakes are homies. So we have to find another derogatory word for United States. I like Great Satan. Maybe I'll say Great Satan, but I feel like it's not as understood as United States. But in any case, like the U.S. left does not understand settler colonialism by and large, and so even as we've seen like growing anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist consciousness blooming because of the mass mobilizations for Palestine led by Palestinian organizations like Florida Palestine Network, People are holding it up as a special case and not making the connections to what's happening throughout the rest of the planet. And it's extremely important that we do that, especially in this context, because you don't understand anything about how to make revolution in a settler state like the United States unless you understand settler colonialism. So we're going to get into it, like I said, with the example of Zimbabwe. And we love engagement. We love interaction. So definitely drop your comments, drop your questions, drop additional context that you have into the chat. And I will engage y'all to the best of my ability. I can see your comments. I will also, throughout the presentation, share resources where you can learn more about settler colonialism in Zimbabwe and about the history we're going to get into today. And I'll also share my slide deck. And is there anything else? Is there anything else? Oh yeah, like and share the video. Like and share the video, and let's get into it. So I'm using OBS, Open Broadcast Software. Like I said, I'm a production studio of one. And so I made this like overlay, which is pretty cool, right? Right? That says communist with the Instagram. Go follow us on Instagram for communist. That's our YouTube channel. And then there's my name. Look at that. Look at that. And then I also made a slide deck. And then I put like a little picture in picture so my face will be on it. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's see if this works. Can you see me? Can you still hear me? Help me out. Is it working? Greetings, Alex. Greetings, Araya. If I did not pronounce that wrong, right? I apologize. Greetings, Frankie. Are y'all still able to hear my voice? And can you see the slide? I'm going to assume yes. And then if you cannot see me, then I'm going to assume that someone will say something. But I'm just going to keep talking. So, okay, you can see me. Great. Appreciate y'all. Thank you, Belle. Thank you, Rao's Pasta Sauce. I love Rao's Pasta Sauce. Thank you, Jay. Okay, so let's talk about some basics about Zimbabwe. Before the modern nation of Zimbabwe existed, there was a vast pre-colonial African civilization known as the Great Zimbabwe, and that is what was originally on Zimbabwe's land base. It started off as the Great Zimbabwe, then became Kingdom Mutapa and Rozwi, and it was a major trade center in Africa. Unlike you have probably heard in capitalist schools, Africa was not an uncivilized wasteland with nothing going on until European colonizers came to visit. Absolutely not. Africa had many, many thriving nations, many, many thriving civilizations and cities, and engaged with trade, not just on the continent, but with nations from all over the planet, including China, the Arab world, and Europe. In fact, the first Europeans to come to Africa came to Africa to engage in trade as so-called equals before they, do what imperialism called them to do and betrayed everybody that had previously done business with them. But in any case, that's what the Great Zimbabwe was. It was a trade center in Africa. It engaged with trade with all sorts of nations around the world, China, the Arab world, Europe. It engaged in trade of gold, of copper, of ivory. And there was an extremely high standard of living because they engaged in the practice of communal land ownership and a communal sharing of resources. So it was a highly developed society. It engaged in international trade, and it met the basic needs of its population before Europeans ever got there. Then, of course, Europeans, they went in their exploratory missions, their mercenary missions. They were, paid by the crown to sail around the world looking for things to steal. And so the first Europeans arrived in the 1500s. That is the Portuguese, but they would not be the last. Soon after the Portuguese, you see the Dutch rolling through, you see the British rolling through, you see the Germans rolling through. And at first, everybody was engaging in trade, everybody was engaging in equals, but that wouldn't last for long. Instead, the Europeans began fighting each other for control of the wealth, resources, and land of the Great Zimbabwe. And that led to a period of widespread destruction. Does this sound familiar? Known as the Mfikane. And we're going to talk about exactly what that looked like and how it laid the groundwork for what will become the later colonization of the region. In the present day, however, Zimbabwe is an independent state. They successfully overthrew European settler-colonialism in an armed struggle, which we're going to talk about a lot. They have a current population of around 60 million people. The ruling party and the prime minister are both part of ZANU-PF. And also the major resources of Zimbabwe in the modern day are, of course, its land, vast quantities of arable land, and also tobacco, oil, coal, diamonds. And so you can get a sense of the wealth that Zimbabwe has. We got gold, we got copper, we got diamonds, we got tobacco, we got land, and you can also get a sense of why Europeans immediately started fighting amongst themselves to try to take control of it. And then what are y'all saying in the comments? People are saying it's tough. I know, thank you. Graphic design is my passion, am I right? What else? Hope we can cover the recent changes in land ownership. And then Segun says, Agrarian South Network has a great research bulletin about settler-colonialism in the late neocolonial stage that has a great essay on Zimbabwe. I think you shared that before, Karamat, and I did check it out. And it's a great article. Feel free to share the link. So, Zimbabwe and the Chimurenga. When we talk about Zimbabwe's national liberation struggle, it's important to understand it in phases that have lasted for centuries. Zimbabwe's liberation struggle began when the very first European colonizers set foot in Zimbabwe with the intention of stealing land and resources, and has continued for centuries into the modern day. The national liberation struggle can be understood in distinct phases. Those phases are known as Chimurengas. Chimurenga is a Shona word which means a revolutionary struggle, a fight for dignity, human rights, and justice. So the Chimurengas, these phases of the national liberation struggle of Zimbabwe, continue to this day. The first Chimurenga was that resistance to the initial invasion of European colonizers in the 1500s, when the Europeans started stealing and looting and raping and destroying the Africans in Zimbabwe and all over the continent, immediately began to fight back. And that is the first Chimurenga, the first phase of the national liberation struggle, that initial resistance to invasion. The second Chimurenga is known as the armed phase of the national liberation struggle, when ZANU and ZAPU took up arms against the resistance of European settlers and fought to take their land back. So that's what we know as the armed revolutionary struggle in Zimbabwe. That is the second Chimurenga. And then the third Chimurenga is the period that we are in right now. The armed phase of the national liberation struggle was successful in forcing these European colonizers to give up the land, to give Zimbabwe independence, or the Zimbabweans, the Africans in Zimbabwe took their independence. That's what the armed struggle resulted in. The victory in the armed struggle resulted in. And then the third phase is when they're in the process of taking the land back. And we're going to talk about what that looks like. It started off with like some militant direct action on the part of veterans of the second Chimurenga, and then went into a legalized process, a process legalized by the government of Zimbabwe. But this phase, the land back phase, is also characterized by sanctions. The imperialist powers did not just, give up the land and leave Zimbabwe alone. No, they responded by attempting to destroy Zimbabwe's economy, attempting to starve the African population of Zimbabwe out, attempting to basically overthrow the ZANU-PF government, the liberation government. That is the intent of the sanctions. And so that is the phase of the Chimurenga, or the liberation struggle that we're in right now. The third Chimurenga is the land back phase, and also the phase of resisting neocolonialism and resisting economic sanctions. Oopsies. Okay, cool. So let's talk about the first Chimurenga. Like I mentioned, the Portuguese entered Zimbabwe in the early 1500s. They were not the only ones for long. They were followed by the Dutch, the Germans, the British, all sorts of European colonizers. The European colonizers were like, ooh, look at this. This is noise. We can't just share it. We can't just work side by side with the Africans. No, let's fight amongst ourselves for control of this territory that's not ours. And in the meantime, create a period of widespread destruction and devastation. The Europeans basically enlisted different African nations that they could to wage war against each other. The Europeans also fought pitched armed battles on African territory that targeted civilian populations, again, scrambling for control of African resources. They basically caused a period of widespread instability that drastically weakened the African nations in this territory. And then the Europeans exploited that weakness created by the instability that they had caused in order to move in and start stealing land. And so one of the nations that was resisting this process was known as the Ndebele. They started off much more south of Zimbabwe in what became Azania, South Africa, but they were driven north by the Dutch settlers known as the Boers during the Mfecane. So the Ndebele are fighting against the Boers. They're moving north, trying to get away from them. They encounter the Rozwi Empire in the territory of the Great Zimbabwe. They fight with the Rozwi Empire, and they establish their own city of Bulawayo. And then the Ndebele engage in long-term resistance of the European settlers. They are able to maintain that resistance for several hundred years. However, At one point, their leader dies, and his son, Lobongula, comes to power. And Lobongula, unfortunately, decides that he's going to try to make a deal with the European colonists to try to like get them to keep their hands off, to focus on destroying other nations. And so Lobongula makes a deal with the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rose. He offers them mining concessions, but the British South Africa Company has much more in mind than mining concessions. They want all of the land. And so the British South Africa Mining Company uses this mining concession from Lobongula to argue that it is a charter, in fact, granting the British Crown the right to steal land in Zimbabwe. So basically, Lobongula gave an inch, and the British South Africa Company took a mile. And so the British South Africa Company starts building a settler police force, the British South Africa Company Police, and they essentially hire settlers, European settlers, to go into Zimbabwe in a trail of straight up covered wagons. It looks like the Oregon Trail video game. I'm not kidding. It's known as the Pioneer Column. Like if you're on your computer right now, Google Pioneer Column Zimbabwe and look at the picture. It's literally covered wagons. It's really wild. So the British South African Company of like private police, mercenaries, you know, contracted by like the Pinkertons, basically lead this column of covered wagons of European settlers into the heart of Zimbabwe, and all along the way, they are terrorizing and killing African people in order to allow these employees, these settlers, to steal land and establish a settlement for this private company, the British South Africa Company. All along the way, the African nations in Zimbabwe are resisting. The Shona and the Mbela are attempting to fight back. The settler police have machine guns. There's one weapon in particular they used, known as the Maxim gun, that was capable of firing many, many, many rounds at once, that basically like tore bodies apart. That is one thing that Western imperialism is very good at, developing weapons of war to terrorize indigenous populations. And so they use that gun and other weapons to basically like clear the way, to plow down the Africans and to allow the Europeans to establish the settlement for the British South Africa Company. So, and the picture on the slide is actually, you can't really see it, it's covered by the black box, but this is Lobongula. And this is an employee of the British South Africa Company, and this is the meeting where Lobongula tried to give them the mining concession, and they were like, bet, we can take the land. Nice. So, birth of a settler state, and I really want y'all to think about how this was established by a company. The British Crown contracted this company, the British South African Company, to engage in corporate expansion through settler colonialism and genocide in Zimbabwe. So the state of Rhodesia that y'all are probably familiar with, it was established by this company, the British South Africa Company, oopsies, that was hired by the British Crown. Hold on, I like messed up my window. There we go. Production team of one. Is it back? What have I done? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I lost my train of thought because of the technical issues. Okay, so the British South African Company establishes Rhodesia in 1895. They have their own currency. You can actually see the picture on the slide. I'm covering it a little bit, but you can see it's like a 10-pound note. It says British South African Company. It says Rhodesia right in the middle. 10 shillings. This is the currency established in the settler colony, established by this private corporation that was contracted by the British Crown to steal land in Zimbabwe for the British Empire. These are mercenaries. These are like, what's that company? Like BlackRock. Or what's the other one? You know, like these private corporations that engage in warfare in places like Iraq, in places like Iran, in places in like Syria now, in places like Ukraine, like these companies that are contracted out by the US military to engage in warfare, like this is what this is. This is what this is. So the British South African Company establishes Rhodesia. They set up their currency. They set up their structure of the state. And then they say to the British government, okay, this is ready to go. Can you pay for your services? The British government buys out the British South Africa Company, but allows them to keep the profits from the mines that have been established. And the British government takes over the Rhodesian territory, and Rhodesia becomes a self-governing British settler colony. Again, the British Empire, the British monarchy, contracts with this private company to establish a settler colony. And the way they establish that settler colony is engaging in genocide and theft of land with their little pioneers, with their pilgrims. And then once it's all set up, once all the Africans have been decimated, then the British company the British government buys out the company and establishes a British settler colony. This is how settler-colonialism works. It's not a clash of civilizations. It's not an ancient conflict. It's like literally corporate expansion, capitalist growth. So Britain buys the British settler colony from that company. And then they start setting up their laws, their system of government. They start institutionalizing the violence of settler-colonialism through law. And so one of the laws they pass is the Land Apportionment Act, which basically says that Africans, the indigenous Africans in Zimbabwe, can no longer buy their own land, can no longer own their own land. They also established a system of laws to establish an apartheid state in Zimbabwe, basically saying Africans, you can only be in this area. If you want to go to this area on your own land, then you need permission from a European settler. Perhaps you're working in their house. Perhaps they're exploiting your labor some other way. You must have permission from the person who's squatting on your land and able to travel from one side to the other. What does that sound like? What does that sound like? Does that not sound like occupied Palestine and the set system of checkpoints established by the Zionist entity? Does it not sound like the reservation system established in the so-called United States, where indigenous people were corralled into tiny portions of land that were then policed by settler police and state troopers? Does that not sound very similar to you? But in any case, Britain establishes the structure of laws, the Land Apportionment Act, all the legal framework of that apartheid state in Zimbabwe. And the intent of all this legislation and the establishment of the state is to institutionalize the oppression of Africans on their own land and concretize the dominance of European settlers. Same purpose of Jim Crow, same purpose of the apartheid state in occupied Palestine, same purpose as any kind of settler state established on someone else's land. Like if you're going to come into someone's territory and steal their stuff and kill their children and poison their water in their land, you got to establish some like rules and regulations. Otherwise, they are going to organize and overthrow you. So this is the intent of this apartheid state. So, like I said, when we talk about the establishment of a settler state, we cannot talk about it as a clash of civilizations. We cannot talk about it as an ancient religious conflict. We can't talk about it like manifest destiny, like some people are just meant by God to have someone else's land. None of that shit is true. What it actually is capitalist expansion. Get that? If you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember that settler colonialism is capitalist expansions. These tiny, tiny countries, like if you look at the landmass of like Britain or Spain or Portugal or France, these are tiny ass countries that were able to grow into global powers. And the way that they did that is by expanding their wealth and their power through settler colonialism. This is how they built into empires. So this is how settler colonialism, its relationship to the expansion of capitalism, its relationship to the expansion of imperialism. The British South Africa Company was a privately owned company hired by the British royalty to engage in colonization in southern Africa. Cecil Rhodes, who we just mentioned, who's also the namesake of that like so-called prestigious scholarship, like the Rhodes Scholars, I bet you've heard of that. It's literally named for this guy who is an architect of genocide, like a rapist, like a monster, and people are getting, anyway, let me not get into that. Let me not get into that tangent because I'll start cussing him out and we'll be here all night. But I'm saying that to say he was a shareholder in this private company, the British South Africa Company. Other shareholders included the Rothschilds, I bet you've heard that name. De Beers, I bet you heard that name as well. These were capitalists. These were people who were investing in this company to profit from genocide and theft of land. And the British South Africa Company, this is not just a model that was followed in Zimbabwe. This model of monarchies hiring private companies to engage in acts of colonization to expand the territories of the metropoles of the European nations, of the Western countries, it is followed across the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, you have the East India Company. Like you probably heard that before, but that is why company is in the name. It's a privately, it's like they're literally mercenaries, paid colonizers. Like that's what this is. The Plymouth Company, The pilgrims that landed on Plymouth Rock. This blew my mind when I learned this. The pilgrims that landed on Plymouth Rock were employees of the Plymouth Company. Those were that when they built that settlement on indigenous territory in the United States. That was a company town. They had to work for the Plymouth Company to pay the cost of their tickets to get on those goddamn boats to come here and steal land. Another example is the Anglo-Palestine Company. And I'm going to look at my notes to make sure I say this correctly because this one is wild. Hold on. So the Anglo-Palestine Company was one of the corporations that helped establish the illegal Zionist entity in occupied Palestine. One of the first companies that started the project of settler colonialism. Hold on. I'm going to have to Google because I just want to make sure I get this right. And hold on. Let me pause. All right. Okay. Okay. So thanks activities in Palestine. So, okay, hold on. Okay. So I'm reading from the Wikipedia page on the Anglo-Palestine Company. It says, the antecedents of the Jewish colonial trust can be traced to Herzl's visionary tract. Herzl referring to Theodor Herzl, one of the ideological fathers of Zionism. So Herzl in Der Judenstaat details his vision of how the Jewish state would be created. A major role was assigned in this vision to a huge body to be called the Jewish Company, which would be founded as a joint stock company subject to English jurisdiction, framed according to English laws, and under the protection of England. In Herzl's vision, this company would control virtually all the land in Palestine and would take care of transporting there millions of people within a few years, meaning settlers, all or nearly all Jews living of the world. It would then take care of all the logistics of settling them in their new country, establish them in urban and rural environments, and getting agricultural, trade, and industry growing. For the Herculean task envisioned for it, Herzl estimated that the company should be about 1,000 million marks. That's $200 million in current funds. So the Anglo-Palestine Company is the company that Herzl called for in Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, to essentially establish the Zionist settler colony in occupied Palestine. The Anglo-Palestine Company still exists. Today, it's known as Bank Leumi Israel, and it is the National Bank of Israel. And so this company was established just like the British South Africa Company to establish the settler colony in occupied Palestine. It did that. And then in the modern day, it was transformed into the National Bank of the Zionist entity. And it is similar to the British South Africa Company, backed by the British government when they were trying to establish that settler colony in occupied Palestine. So, and Herzl, someone saying Herzl was an acquaintance of Cecil Rhodes, if I heard correctly. That is correct. It was Herzl that wrote a letter to Cecil Rhodes where he was basically like, I see what you're doing in Southern Africa. I would like to do that here. We're basically on the same side. We're trying to build white nationalist settler states on other people's land. So, help me out. Put me on game. Show me how you did that. Let's share tactics. Yeah, you can. If you Google Theodor Herzl or Cecil Rhodes, you can find a letter that Herzl wrote to Rhodes, basically saying, I'm trying to get you like you. And if someone has a second to Google that and put in the chat, feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'll do it later. But I'm saying all this to say, again, that we cannot exceptionalize any settler project anywhere in the world. They all functioned in this way. They are projects of imperialist and capitalist expansion, not a class of civilizations, not like an ancient religious conflict, not anything that the mainstream media tries to describe it as to not make you realize the connections. These are literally the ways that global imperialism became global. And from the very beginning, they were profit-making